Assassin's Promise by Thomas Woodward. Chapter 72. Kane struggled for breath. The sun still beat down on him. How much time had passed? It felt like waves that crashed over him, but it was only the stale, hot wind. Had he become mad and simply not realized it yet? He felt it where his hands were bound, but he could feel no bonds holding him fast. He flexed the muscles of his legs, and they too moved freely. His body no longer rolled limply along to the bouncing motion of a cart. Looking beside him, he saw only sand. His left hand cupped a fistful before he let it fall slowly to the earth between his fingers. His good eye pulsed in pain. The light was blinding. He didn't feel the heat, not yet. His senses came to him briefly before being tugged away again, as if he lay adrift on a great tide. Sand was heaped in great towering mounds. Dunes circled him. His body pressed into the earth as if he were some half-discovered artifact. His mouth felt unbearably dry, coarse. There was no better description to how he felt. Sun rays sliced his skin like razors, heat blistering on him like morning dew. But still he felt nothing. No heat, no sound. Only the brief motion of the wind, as it moved him like a forgotten marionette. His cloak blew across his face, the lines of fabric harsh against his damaged eyesight. Blurrily, as if in a dream, he labored to bring himself up to a sitting position. What had he seen? He had been a prisoner, of that he was almost sure. The deep thrumming of the shadow blade formed a counterpoint to the staccato beating of his heart. Grit and saliva washed away as Kane smeared his face roughly with the back of one hand. He could feel the friction across his beaten skin. It felt rough to the touch, like day-aged leather. Looking up with more intent, he surveyed his surroundings. The tall dunes stood like a great ancient race, looking down on him as they might an insect. He felt like one, crushed beneath the heat and mire of the world. Clawing clumps of sand, Kane stood, an isolated figure in a wall of golden gray. The ringed peak stood above a great sea of desert. He could see swirling patterns below him, resolving into waves of sand and dust. The sudden burst of lightning that struck against the dry landscape. The darkness of great roiling storms of boiling sand and earth, punctuated by the blasts of energy, pure and terrible. He saw more, a great canyon with what looked like it may have once been a great river, now no more than caked mud. The dead river stretched on for miles, winding around bends in the canyon's deep fissure-like inlets. A horse. No, the body of a horse. It lay mute against the sand and wind. Earth sheltered the poor beast, its final resting place both serene and infinitely changing. He recognized the packs it had been carrying. Stone pillars lay toppled like dominoes, rents plowed deep into the sand around them. The sparkle of jade, the dark brilliance of jet marble and onyx. Fractured behemoths lay broken, their visages splintered among the rocks that lay strewn amid the great sea. Face in his hands, he wept, or would have had he been capable of such an act. No, he felt nothing, not fear or loss, only acceptance for what was now. He could feel the pulse of his god quicken at his side. The mad, blinded god, his face smeared in black, crusted blood, where it had fallen from the deep eye sockets that had been scourged before time itself. Ever the cur, ever the waiting instrument, he buckled and finally lay broken. Breathing in shallow, hateful breaths, he turned over the image again in his mind. A bending, a warping of reality itself. Two lengths of steel became one, and then split again, linking and curving and twisting unnaturally before his gaze. It kept his mind directed. He placed a rough hand over the shadow blade and pressed down until his hand ached in pain. He felt that pain, long and sweet, fixed like a star in his mind's eye. Then he removed his other hand from his face and stood. His cold gaze met the harsh heat of the blistering sands beneath him. Stepping forward, he moved down the mountain of sand upon which he had found himself, feeling the muscles of his legs and arms complaining with every step. Who had held him here? He covered his great turquoise eye and laughed bitterly. A cold gusting thing, small besides the wind that raced along the dunes beneath him. Fingering his belt, he moved like a wraith in the blowing sand, suddenly bent upon purpose once more. Hatred pervaded his every movement, so with it the darkness came behind his eyes again. He began to feel once more like his old self. Wind lashed his dark hair and whipped it about him madly as he made his descent, shadows moving strangely beneath his diminutive form. He would find this city. Perhaps the boy had made it to safety. For now, all he cared about in the world lay beyond a wall of sand. He gritted his teeth as the wind rose higher, blasting him again and again with sharp bursts. Buffeted like a spider, he carefully stalked downwards, ever downwards, towards his prey. Great gale forces lurched at him, but they were no more than a shadow of what he had tasted before. Knowing this, he laughed bleakly into the wind. Who could know a man's future? Who indeed? Moving with a quickened pace, Cain emerged from the swirling storm of sand and dirt, frenzied hail pelting him as he moved onwards towards his destination. With assiduous fingers, he rifled through the pack that clung to the dead beast. Gathering water skins and food rations, he tied them into place or slung them across his back. Unfurling what remained of the map, he shook his head in dismay. Nothing was marked here on the map. Nothing but empty space, the space between other markings. There had been no town, as he had been led to believe, south of Sky Peak. He had been certain he could replace this small map with a more complete accounting upon reaching the next desert town. He was still far from his eventual target. Thinking back to the immense storm when he had been separated from the boy, he wondered what had become of the lad. There had been a city. He had seen it with his own eyes, unbelieving until the very last moment. He had never heard of a city out here in the desert. There were great, immense stretches of desert that had remained uncharted for centuries. Only those crazy enough to attempt it had seen it, but few ever had made it back. Bad omens were said to befall any with a desire to move past the final line of cities, the last bastion of human life before the unknown reaches. Stories told ancient tales of ghost-like apparitions appearing amid storms of sand, appearing to be lifelike human children. Some wore the faces of those who had died long ago. Cain believed none of the mad ramblings. They were stories, nothing more, told by housewives to their children, to keep them indoors at night. There was nothing new with folk superstition. People had dreamed of naming the unnameable since the dawn of time. No sense messing with a good thing. If it worked for them, what did he care to change their beliefs? He had never ascribed them to them himself. He was often the blade in the night. Those who stalked the night and wore it like a mantle did not fear it. Finding nothing else of value he could strap to himself, Cain moved away, already forgetting the crushed animal. A means to an end. So many things were in this life. He took a small sip from a water skin and was shocked as the water hit his throat. His body greedily gulped more before he could help himself. Only after draining the first water skin was he able to get control of himself and hold himself off from drinking until his thirst was slaked. He feared it would never be. His mouth again felt dry and lifeless, like old parchment, faded and bleached in the sun. Shattered columns littered the faint but unmistakable road he and the lad had been following before what? He couldn't remember. Holes the size of wagon trains filled what had remained of his memory of the event. Shaking his head absently, he saw other wonders. Statues lay broken on their sides. Colorful figures out of nightmare or fantastical dream lay scattered over the landscape. Giant bird-like figures, eyes dark and ominous, and faces that stood 20 feet high, tilted crazily from the tops of pillars that stood ponderously over the great entrance. He could see the gates in the distance. They lay far back. Swirling wind and dirt kept them from his view. Dust devils sprang up violently and sputtered out into nothing before his travel-worn gaze. Kane shuffled along like a beggar, moving slowly against the sand. Like a beetle, he crawled forward with great care, fearful of being crushed by forces beyond his understanding or control. Spires rose heaving into the broken sky. The great arms of bronze rose like mountains of metal glass, polished and reflecting the sun. They climbed above the city, above the horizon. They continued to stretch upwards beyond sight's end. Mesmerized, Kane stood motionless, seeing them truly for the first time. With a great weight, he pulled his gaze back down to the earth. Adobe walls stood a full 40 spans into the air. Great guardhouses were positioned every 20 spans or so. They were interspersed by immense carvings of jade. The delicate sculptures paled the work of the finest artisans he had seen. The statuettes were shaped in both white and green jade, thick veins of gold weaving through each figure like the vines of a budding blossom. He could only guess at the sheer monetary value they would hold if they ever saw the light of day beyond this city. The gate itself, a gigantic mesh of iron slats, formed a grille that was composed of rectangular holes no larger than a handspan across. He would be unable to pass without activating some mechanism to open the bars, if one existed. If he chose to climb the wall, he would be exposed to enemy arrow fire, or having burning pitch poured on him during his ascent. Kane could see no glimmer of life from the two immediately placed guardhouses that stood above the main gate, situated on either side of the rampart wall at its perch. Would he trust that no harm would truly come to him, should he press to gain entry into the city? Perhaps there was another entrance somewhere. As he searched down the wall with his good eye, he stepped onto a strange, uneven space on the roadway. Looking down, he realized in fascination and horror that steel spikes were hidden in the very entranceway. Should the activating mechanism be loosed, the spikes could be raised to form an effective barrier to a cavalry charge, not to mention a lethal fosse, which one could fall onto if he lost his purchase while climbing the wall of the main gate. But he sensed no life here. There was no movement. Only the sound of wind in his ears as it moved lifelessly through the landscape. The dust and heat mixed as he breathed deep. Slowly his senses were returning to him, as if he had been asleep for a long while. Looking skyward again, he still saw no movement from the guardhouses that were positioned carefully along the top of the wall. With a delicate pressing of his hand, he felt along the metal grille of the gate. It was solid as stone. Breathing out evenly, Kane began to pull himself up, rung by rung, as he ascended the wall of metal which bit into the thick stone parapets. The sun poured down on him hotly as he continued his climb. It was the silent climb of a man who is unsure if anyone, himself included, is truly alive. The wind beckoned to him as he sweated and pulled and clung to the wall. It felt like a distant lover, cold and sweet. He chose not to listen, and stepped into another space between the metal bars. As Kane pulled himself over the lip of the wall, he could see statues fade off into the distance in both directions, lined in perfect unison along the outer wall. Looking down behind the battlements, he saw a street that raced forward like a great arrow in the sand, before pulling sharply in another direction. Lines of bleak adobe buildings stood silent as death next to the street. They hung from a level above the street, perched ominously above, like a half-forgotten project of a long-dead architect.